Hello and welcome to the third and last panel of the Istanbul Education Summit 2021 on its first day. Professor Haluk Görgün, Chairman, CEO and President of Aselsan, who gave his keynote speech regarding the digitalization on education, and he covered the metaverse impact for education. His speech can be reached through our website and social media accounts. Technology impacts many aspects of our lives, bringing about certain changes and transformations. This session will address those innovations which digitalization triggered in the education sector, alongside all other aspects of human life, as well as the opportunities that easy and quick access to information generate, and what impact they have on education systems. Now we will discuss the impact of digitalization on education with our respected and distinguished speakers. Micheal Stevenson, the Senior Advisor, Program for International Student Assessment at OECD. He has also leads the High Performance Systems for Tomorrow initiative on education in the age of machine intelligence. Sümeyye Ceylan, the co-founder and the managing partner of Usturlab. Her main academic interests are science education, philosophy of mathematics, history of science, and social entrepreneurship. Punya Mishra is Associate Dean and Professor of Office of Scholarship and Innovation at Arizona State University. She has also an affiliate appointment in the Herberger Institute for the Design and Arts. Umar Saif is the founder and CEO at surveyauto.com and Chief Digital Officer at Jang Media Group. He is also an advisor to United Nations Development Program in Pakistan. Sheninger is an associate partner with the International Center for Leadership in Education. His works are on leading and learning in the digital age as a model for moving schools and districts forward. I would like to start the last session of the first day of the summit with Micheal Stevenson's views. Mr. Stevenson, we see a digital transformation in the emerging learning ecosystem. How do you expect education system to react to this change and transformation? What kind of roadmap do you envision?
Well, thank you very much for asking me to talk to you today, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all. I guess this is what I would say after a few years of looking at PISA performance around the world, how young people do in maths, science and reading, and the role that digital is playing in supporting their learning at system level. I mean, to be honest, PISA has not found impressive correlations between student learning outcomes and ICT maturity at system level. I wish we had, but we haven't. I guess we've been looking mainly at the impact of classroom hardware on learning outcomes. And we really don't see that the more you pile digital projectors, laptops, devices of every kind into the classroom, the better the students' performances in maths or literacy or anything else. But maybe that's because we have been looking at the impact of classroom hardware, and maybe it would have been a different story if we'd been looking at software and in particular at learning content. Well, perhaps, but even so, I'm not sure. I think too much learning content has been about supporting traditional pedagogies and modes of teaching and learning, propping up the old, and too little learning content has been about supporting innovative pedagogies for the 21st century. But I do think that something's changing, and there's a new generation coming through that I think is capable of transforming teaching and learning. And you can call it lots of things, but I guess one way to call it is intelligent tutoring systems, which strike me as representing a huge leap forward. This idea that we can engage every learner in confronting the most challenging disciplinary and interdisciplinary concepts in their maths, in their science, in their humanities, that we can push them into problem-solving situations, give them instant feedback, and then through the algorithm generate the next problem and the next problem according to their particular learning style and needs. I think this is potentially transformational, the leap forward. And to those who say, why hasn't technology changed education the way it's changed health in the last 100 years? Maybe this is part of the answer. But for me, I'd want to think about how that next generation of technologies, which I think is remarkable, plays out across the Education 2030 scenarios that Holonique gave us just 2 or 3 years ago, thinking about how the education landscape might change. And if you think of what they were, there was business as usual, nothing changes at all. Robot revolution, everything changes. It's all done by robots. Peer-to-peer, teachers begin to do what's always been so difficult, work with one another in small groups, in large groups, in global groups to develop their practice. And then 2 big tech scenarios. One, global giants, a couple of major tech players scoop the game and in effect take over education, replacing the role of publicly funded governments. And then a version of that which is regional, rising, big players within particular regions, could be in the Middle East, could be in North America, could be in China. But if you think of those scenarios and what that might mean for this world where technology suddenly does begin to be making a leap, well, it's clear that we're not talking about business as usual. This is the absolute opposite of business as usual. Maybe we're talking about the robot revolution, but I don't think anybody wants to see teachers banished from the classroom. It's possible that we could have the peer-to-peer heaven, but that would mean striking a very intelligent balance between the role of the teacher and the role of the technology, the intelligent tutoring system. Possible, it could focus the teacher in areas which are not touched by intelligent tutoring systems, areas of the curriculum, but also on developing the whole child. I think the real worry is that what we actually see is global giants or regional risings. And at that point, I guess, there's a real risk that major tech players come in and make an offering to students and schools around the world, kind of over the heads of governments and the schools and the students. It's for profit, and though it might drive up standards, I think it could be at the price of equity and offering everybody that chance, that fair chance of a great start in life. So I actually see, just to conclude my initial thoughts on the roadmap forward, a triple challenge for policymakers, including those with whom we've worked at the OECD, the High Performing Systems for Tomorrow initiative. I think one of those challenges is probably to move forward, new purposes and priorities for education. And I hope to come to that in subsequent parts of this conversation. But that would look a bit different from simply the foundational literacies. I think a second challenge is to balance the teacher and the technology in a way that could get the education sector to where health has been through its investment in technology over the last 10 years, of 100 years, but without banishing the human. And thirdly, I think the challenge is to work with the tech sector to protect publicly funded education that secures that fair start for everybody in life. So that's the roadmap that I see ahead, and a very difficult roadmap too.
Mr. Stevenson, thank you so much for sharing your views. And I would like to talk one of our esteemed speakers, Sümeyye Ceylan. Could you please tell us that how do you evaluate the enrichment of education system in terms of digital tools for the future of education?
I would like to thank you very much for asking me to speak too as well. The digital world is increasingly penetrating the education skills domain. Every day a new technology emerges. This penetration is coupled with future changes to the mode and pattern of work, which are themselves affected by the current climate of economic uncertainty we live nowadays, and as well as the political shifts countries face. Given the increased use of fast-changing digital technologies in the workplace, new skills children need. The use of these technologies have contributed to the transforming the new learning and skill development programs, and these programs became a lifelong progress. And you started calling this lifelong learning. The use of these technologies has contributed to transforming learning and skills development into a lifelong process. People now have to continue to develop and refresh their skills and knowledge in order to keep up with the constant innovations and new developments in the digital world. And they need to better themselves every 3 years, because every day a new technology emerges and we can't keep up with this change. Today, it's necessary for all of us. I am not a digital native as my son, but I have to be digitally active every day, every hour. So it's necessary for every active citizen to be to have digital skills, such as going to a doctor appointment or personal banking. For some members of society which are not digital natives, it's really hard to keep up with these changes. So educational system overall have to ensure that every citizen develops these necessary skills to remain active and included in this increasingly digital society. Nowadays, technical knowledge on programming and coding and analysis and mathematics, these STEAM skills are everybody talks about these skills, but we forget something. If we want to live in a functioning society free from discrimination, we need social, emotional skills as well. And skills like communication, literacy, critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, personal resilience, and reflection. Most of the current education systems are still working on performance-based quantitative measures, which do not take into account how necessary social and emotional skills are to people's ability to function in employment and in society at large. So I want to emphasize that the enrichment of digital tools for the future of the education is really important, but we must not forget that the other skills are necessary to enrich our educational systems to learn digital skills as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sümeyye, Ceylan. And Punya Mishra, Associate Dean and Professor at Arizona State University. I would like to ask you that what advantages and disadvantages does the digitalization and internationalization of education bring to education systems?
Thank you very much again for inviting me to speak at this meeting. And it's Thanksgiving here in the US, so I also want to wish everybody it's a day where, just to have gratitude for all that we have. And so thank you again for that, for the invitation. Now, the issue of, and Micheal, thanks for your comments. I want to build on something that you said. When we think of the advantages and disadvantages of digitalization, I mean, we've been having this conversation for decades now. So the question that comes up is why, like Micheal, as you asked, why aren't changes happening in education that we would expect that we see in other domains? Every aspect of human life has been transformed in some form or the other, whether you look at the arts, whether you look at business or economic, medicine has been transformed by technology, but yet in education, we don't see that same thing. And I think that's the fundamental question that we need to ask. And I think that, yes, digital technologies give us a lot of power. The fact that we can take analog and convert it into bits and bytes then allows us to share and stream and modify and remix. And we see the level of human creativity that we see, whether you see TikTok or you see YouTube or you see Instagram. I mean, people are incredibly creative in mixing and matching and doing a lot of things which otherwise would not have been possible before. Traditional gatekeepers who were present in terms of, if you look at influencers and so on, a lot of traditional gatekeeping has broken down, allowing for this groundswell of creativity across the world. Now, I think the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves, and I think this alludes, Micheal, to something you said earlier, which is that we are still focused on certain traditional systems, and what we are taking are these technologies and putting them within sort of traditional boxes. And unless and until we start really thinking about how these systems can be changed, because the technology, you could have a really powerful technology, but if you use it, for instance, I don't know how many of you know of these tools such as Proctorio, which are used in testing situations during the pandemic, where my daughter was going to college and she would have to first turn the camera around the room. It would monitor her eye movement to see if she was cheating or not cheating. Think about what that technology, the message it is sending to the learner. It is saying you are not to be trusted. We know you are going to cheat, blah, 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 blah. While in the world of work, just as the previous speaker spoke, we need more collaboration. We need more creativity. So I think it's those fundamental systems that we have to start asking questions about. And I think unless and until we change the system within which the technology works, not much change is going to happen. Over the past year and a half, just as the pandemic began, with a few colleagues of mine, we started this thing called Silver Lining for Learning, where every Saturday we would meet with educators from across the world. And the amount of innovation that we're seeing, we had faculty, guests from Turkey as well on the show a few months back. The amount of innovation that we're seeing at the grassroots level is amazing. Ways of collaborating, just as, Micheal, you spoke about, teachers working with teachers, or educators working with educators, or school systems working with each other, but they're all happening in small pockets. It's not changing the fundamental system within which education today works. And just, we can value creativity and innovation, but the system is not designed to value that. The testing regimes that we have, they will evaluate students, teachers, schools, all have to be rethought from the bottom up. I mean, some of the most powerful examples we had in Silver Lining for Learning were, for instance, we talked to these kids in Nepal who are using MOOCs. They started using these MOOCs to first learn English, and gradually one 13-year-old girl decides that she's really interested in archaeology and now has started taking classes on that. Now, those are isolated incidents that show to us the power that these tools have to give individual learners agency, to give educators agency. Part of the reason we don't see technology, having an impact on education and on scores and so on is because most probably we are asking the wrong questions, and most probably we are setting it up from the very foundation in an incorrect way. I think these tools allow us for a lot of creativity, as long as we think of the creativity and the design of it in a very different way. And so I think I'm both sort of upbeat and sort of not so much. I worry a great deal about the amount of data that is being collected on us. If one thing COVID has done, has done a couple of things, right? One, it showed us that that digitality now is a necessity. It is now a part of how we have to think about education. And there are huge equity issues involved there. Second, that educators can pivot and can be creative in times like this, because we've seen that across the globe. But it also brings to me the fear that now there is data on anybody and everybody from the age of 5 onwards. And that really worries me, because this is data that can pinpoint individuals, that can be used in ways to manipulate, to persuade. And those are incredible challenges. And I worry that whether it's Facebook, whether it's Google, or whoever. I don't trust any of these companies because they have demonstrated to us over and over again that they are not worthy of our trust. I think the same thing goes for governments as well. So I think there are some significant challenges that are coming up because of this digitality, not taking away anything from the power that these tools are giving us. But I think we have to approach it with a much bigger conversation on these bigger challenges, because there is this sort of dystopia that I see that can emerge as easily as a utopia. And so that's, to me, is how we need to be thinking about it. I worry a lot. I mean, I used to be, when I look back on myself 10 years ago, I'm known for my work in educational technology. I work a lot with teachers. I came at it with a much more positive attitude. I don't think today, when I look at how these tools have been deliberately designed, whether we look at social media tools and so on, to manipulate our behavior, that the lack of ethical and moral compass in these organizations and companies who are bent upon increasing their numbers over actually doing social good, I am much less optimistic. I think I'm sort of like, I think we are standing at a very crucial fork in time right now, because I think the rise of AI and so on is going to be really powerful. And as a society, I don't think we have developed the rules and laws and policies, or even the ethical frameworks to even ask good questions about these things. So, I can go on and on, as you can imagine. I'm a professor, so I get paid to profess. So I will keep quiet and hear from others and continue the conversation.
Professor Mishra, it was our pleasure to hear your views. And I would like to talk with one of our distinguished speakers, Umar Saif. And Mr. Saif, in the context of Society 5.0, significant changes are experienced in the social life and new ones are upcoming. In the context of these digital changes, what kind of framework should be proposed for teachers' education?
Thank you for having me at this conference. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it was interesting to hear the comments of other panelists also. Let me first start out by addressing the broader issue of digitization of education. After my grad school, I was at MIT for many years, and we worked on, there are folks there who worked on one laptop per child and then one tablet per child. And there was a lot of talk about equipping children, especially in the emerging countries, with technology in hopes of better student learning outcomes and better access to education. And then in my previous life, which is the last 10 years or so, I was actually working for the government of Pakistan. I was a minister for IT in the province of Punjab. And as we grappled with this issue of better access to education, especially in some of the low-income areas, and especially in the public sector, where the scale of the problem in countries like Pakistan is huge. We found many interesting learnings in use of technology in education, or digitization in education. The first one was that, just to lay out the scale of the problem, in Punjab, where I was working, we have 53,000 schools in a single school system. We had 400,000 teachers, about 500,000 teachers, and about 13 million children in these schools. We had an additional 22 million children who were out of school, who couldn't go to school because they couldn't afford to go to school, or their parents put them on daily wages or sort of some kind of labor so they can provide for the family. Now, in an environment like this, one would imagine that technology could play a positive role. And this isn't just Pakistan, this is good about 80, 90 countries of the world, the emerging world, so to speak. Now, what the first speaker said was sort of the first mistake we made in trying to address this problem, which was to get some hardware, equip these children with some laptops or tablets or what have you, so that they can access education. And we found, as folks before us have found, that only buying hardware wouldn't solve this problem. So what we set out to do was quite interesting. We actually took the textbooks, which were quite low quality actually, and converted them into digitized textbooks. And the idea there was not just to take the textbook and put it online, but augment these textbooks with video lectures, animations, simulations, games that children could interact with. And the goal was that they could sort of, this learning content, this pre-canned content could become the source of their learning. It took us a long time to do it. If you visited elearn.gov.pk, you would find yourself on a website where we have digitized 21 books of science and maths from grade 1 to grade 12 in Pakistan, and augmented them with about 21,000 video lectures, as many simulations and games, and so on and so forth. And we put the website up and we made a mobile application out of it. And we thought that people would now install the application, teachers would begin to use it. This is all great content that they could use in classrooms or kids can use at home and learn. And we found out that that's not adequate. Also didn't quite cause the storm that we were hoping this great availability of content, digital content, would create. So the third experiment that we did was to equip the classrooms with some modicum of technology. And I say modicum of technology because this was literally about 8,000 rupees, what, $80 cheap tablets that we gave out to science and maths teachers. And we put up a small LCD screen, like a 40-inch LCD screen, which is about a couple $100, in 1 or 2 classrooms in the school. And we ran a randomized controlled trial. And this is a randomized controlled trial at sort of market scale. This is, you know, a very large education system in the 5th largest country in the world, Pakistan. And we ran this experiment for 1 year as a randomized controlled trial. I had many collaborators from my academic life in US who did the evaluation with us on test scores. And these were test scores throughout the currency of the project, of the evaluation, but as well as the standardized testing exams that we had in the government, called the board examinations. And in this, we found something quite interesting. And so therefore, in this intervention, we did 3 things. We equipped the teacher, not the student, with this content. We trained the teacher, we gave them a tablet, and we put a screen in the classroom. But we also orchestrated, choreographed the interaction of the teacher in the classroom with the students. So the teacher was almost given a script to follow. And the problem, again, that we're trying to solve is 500,000 teachers in 53,000 schools. And the goal is that they're able to somehow teach at a minimum standardized quality of instruction. That's the problem we're trying to solve, right? So we gave them pre-canned content, everything from video lectures to animations to simulations, etc. We equipped the classroom with some modicum of hardware, tablets and a screen. It's not a huge expense. In fact, it came out to be something like $9 per student because there are many students in the classroom. And we ran this experiment. And having sort of these 3 moving parts in place, the first one was availability of high quality content. The second one was some modicum of hardware in the classroom to use that content. But the third critical part was to choreograph the interaction of the teacher with the students with the help of this content. So each teacher was essentially given a script for their classroom, which is play this video lecture for 10 minutes, then engage in an interactive Q&A with students for the next 5. You can then show this simulation for the next 5. Then you have the students engage in this game, so to speak, or this animation for the next 5 minutes. And then you ask them the following questions and so on. We kind of standardize the interaction, choreograph the interaction with the student with the teachers. And this produced absolutely unanticipated and mind-boggling results, in the sense that, as someone who's involved in the previous life with this millions of dollars worth of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of 1 laptop per child and so on and so forth, or projects like edX and Coursera and so on and so forth. But just by doing sort of this intervention at the classroom level, from grade 5 to grade 8 is what we did. The science scores jumped up by 52%. The math scores jumped up by 120%. Overall, there was a 74% improvement in the test scores of students who had access to digital content, some hardware, but also teachers who effectively used that content, as opposed to students who weren't exposed to this. So the treatment was 74% more on average test scores versus control, which of course didn't have this. So we've now written 2 papers on this, and this was largely because most of the sort of Western text or the research around this was essentially sort of, crying out hoarse that digital tech in classroom doesn't quite work, and we agree. But the problem we're trying to solve, of course, was slightly different, but it wasn't just also hardware. It was actually several moving parts coming together. And the papers that we've written, one is appeared in the National Bureau of Economic Research. This is with a couple of collaborators actually in US. It's a lengthy paper. It's a 63-page NBER publication. And we've just recently gotten a paper into the American Economic Journal, AEJ Policy, on this work, and that's also a fairly kind of longish paper. So if some of the people in the audience or in the panel have interest in how to solve sort of this puzzle of trying to use technology to have a minimum standardized quality of education in the emerging countries, low-income countries, where just access to education is a challenge, access to good teaching is a challenge, having teachers available in classrooms is a challenge, and so on and so forth. And that's essentially where sort of, huge challenge lies in the education world. Then this may be a recipe to solve some of that. And the good thing is that because of sort of our academic backgrounds, we were able to sort of do this RCT for 1 year and document the results. And now we've done a couple of peer-reviewed publications. And the AEJ policy paper is actually the only one that's come out of Pakistan in the last 5 years or so in this space. So I would encourage you to look up that paper, and we'll go through it if you have the time. The title of the paper is that equipping teachers with tech is what worked and bypassing teachers didn't. I think that's sort of there and thereabouts is the title of the paper. This was a couple of professors in University of Delaware in US who ran this RCT with us. So that's what I wanted to say. This is sort of a kind of a new perspective on use of tech in education. Of course, COVID is, has brought in many radical changes. One of which is how our children got educated for about 2 years, almost a year and a half, over Zoom. We also found out how teaching or learning is not just a lecture. It's more than that, and Zoom doesn't quite capture that. It does capture the lecturing part quite well, I presume, but that, as we found out, was only half of that puzzle. And education for me, school education, it has its own nuances and its own issues and challenges. But then there's higher education, and the world has been sort of more active in the higher education space in trying to kind of see if tech can help there. I still remember one of the first courses I taught at MIT was eventually turned into an OCW course. It used to be called the Open Courseware course. It's now called edX, which is now many universities coming together and offering courses, and you can also get a certification. But I was going through the agenda that you'd sent us. The one thing I do want to say is that, of course, in the higher education, I think maybe technology has more of a role to play. Also, in the way higher education is evolving, it's probably not as much as kind of a shrink-wrapped undergraduate in computer science. It is a bunch of skills and courses cobbled together in a very flexible environment, which build your skills and knowledge to a point that you could apply it in this new emerging world where large companies no longer even require a college degree for you to get a job most recently. And there, I think the technology could maybe has a bigger role, and therefore you see Coursera's and Udacity's and Udemy's and edX and so on and so forth actually finally acquiring scale, and these MOOCs finally becoming something that could work out. I was a vice chancellor of a university in Pakistan for 5 years, which I established from scratch. And the guy who runs edX was the guy who hired me at MIT, Anand Agarwal, who's a great friend and a mentor. So one of the first things we did was to actually sign an agreement with edX to take the micro masters that now edX offers, which is 4 courses at a time, master's level courses, and offer them in our university, where a local teacher who was also accomplished like a PhD from a good US university was teaching this in a classroom, but students had access to the edX content also. and they had to do a pass-fail from edX, which is the certification you get from there, but the university would give you a letter grade. So this was a model where students would get a letter grade on their transcript for passing the minimum quality of instruction and hence testing on a MOOC from, let's say, UCST or from MIT or whatever. And the local university is able to also give a more granular grade on your transcript. We ran this for many years. It was very successful. Again, emerging countries, I think, would benefit hugely by such kind of models where local professors can use pre-canned content from, the top universities in the world, from repositories like edX, and at times backed by kind of, their testing platforms also. So I think sort of some of that is very, very positive. And final thing I want to say is that, again, in emerging countries, because of lack of resources, schools and teachers and access to education, there's typically a lot of multi-grade classrooms, which means that people in various grades of education actually sit in the same classroom, taught by the same teacher. It's actually a very common problem in these parts of the world. A lot of people don't quite realize this, but I was actually quite amazed also to see this actually happen in front of me in Pakistan. But it's a huge problem here, which means that some children are not even age appropriate for the lecture that's been given. Now, some of the thing that's been said about technology is that, of course, if you had access to a tablet or something, you could get very tailored, customized lesson plan for yourself, which means that you could be ahead or behind in terms of your learning outcomes, just because you're forced to sit in one room where everyone from grade 4 to grade 6 is sitting, right, in a science lecture. You could, if you had access to tech, you could get sort of customized content tailored to your learning needs. And in India,
Umar,
MindSpark
Saif.
has done great work around this, funded by the Gates Foundation. They've written a lot about that also.
Umar,
I'll stop
Saif,
here with those
sorry
thoughts.
for interruption, but unfortunately we already uploaded the time. I would like to continue. Thank you so much for your for sharing your view with us. It was really good information. But now I would like to continue with Eric Sheninger, Associate Partner with the International Center for Leadership in Education. Mr. Sheninger, could you please tell us what aspects of education system can be transformative for students, educators, and parents' relationship with technology?
Thank you. And I think that's the perfect question as I was taking some notes down based upon what my esteemed colleagues were saying. And I'm going to try to pull out some points to answer that question as we really look at transformation. We heard that PISA has not shown performance increases with increasing technology. The context that I have is I visit thousands of classrooms a year. When the pandemic hit, I never stopped working in classrooms. So I kind of have a bird's eye view as we listen to, kind of where we know we are. So when we look at performance, well, as you kind of heard, teaching, learning, and leadership have not changed at scale. We see technology changing, but how has the aspect of teaching, learning, and leadership changed? We look at this disruptive world we live in. We are in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, going to eventually be in the fifth. Artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, automation at scale. In this disruptive world, how are we preparing kids to replace conventional ideas with innovative solutions to authentic problems? No one was prepared for the pandemic. Kids, schools, parents. But if we don't change our practice in terms of making transformation more than a buzzword, the most dangerous phrase in education is that's the way we've always done it. And that's what I see. I see a mass model of education that was built for a world long past that is still entrenched today. I see it in classrooms every single day. And what happens is we often teach to the middle. We teach to one type of learner. We teach to the test. And what happens is those learners that really need our help aren't getting it. And the ones that need to be challenged aren't being challenged. And as we think about families, most families want their kids taught the same way they were taught, because that's what they know. And we often teach the way we were taught, but we also lead the way we were led. one aspect that we have to focus on if we really want transformative change are those who are tasked with power. Are they understanding of what really needs to happen from a pedagogical standpoint? So as we look at transformation, technology, as you've heard, it's just a tool. It's not a learning outcome. The technology should never drive what happens in our classroom. It shouldn't drive, what we want as parents. And as we look at that aspect, another thing when we look at transformation is, what does the professional learning look like? It's not the fault of teachers, leaders, or families if they're not getting professional learning support. What does that look like? You can look at the research from Linda Darling Hammond out of Stanford University, the Wallace Foundation. What educators and families need is job-embedded, ongoing professional learning. Some of the most successful systems here in the United States don't just work with teachers and administrators, they also work to train families on what these changes look like, on how they can support their kids at home. So professional learning has to, be evolved, or else we're going to continue to see the same practices with technology. And I heard some mention about equity, and I heard some mention about agency. Those are two things that I feel we really, really need to hone in on. Let me tell you what I see every single time I walk into a school. All kids doing the same thing at the same time, the same way. That is more about equality. And here's the thing that I will challenge every single one of you listening to do. Equality is giving every kid a device. Equality is every kid getting that lecture or direct instruction. I'm not saying that's bad per se, but that's not equity. We need to focus on equitable practices in the classroom, in our schools. Equity is all kids getting what they need when and where they need it. Equity not only empowers our learners, it empowers families so they can be better equipped to help their kids be successful. Equity can be achieved through personalization. Personalization is a move from what we teach, what's on the test, what's in the curriculum, a move from what to who, the learner, to emphasize ownership of learning. And that's kind of what we want. All of us as adults, thinking about our youngest learners, we all learn differently. And that's why we really have to challenge the status quo. Before I go into my 6, and I'm going to rattle off 6 specific changes that we all can focus on to transform teaching, learning, and leadership that benefits the whole system. But when we think about, where we are, we have to own what we see. So here's step number 1. We got to be honest about where we are. I think that's the hardest thing when I look at education systems, not just in America, but across the world, is we often have a mentality that we are doing things the right way. Now, you could score extremely high on standardized test scores. You could be one of the top countries in, PISA, but that doesn't mean you're meeting the social emotional needs of kids. Those typically are the kids that are the most stressed out because they have to get into the best school, or they have to score a certain range. We got to be honest about where we are. We also, everybody, need to challenge conventional systems. And I think that's the hardest part, is everybody says they want feedback, but are they open to feedback? And conventional systems, what do I mean by that? Is standardized achievement the end goal? How do we begin to move from skills to competencies? You could be skilled at throwing a baseball, but totally incompetent as to how to play the game. Competencies focus on skills and knowledge, but also mindset, behavior, aptitude. We have to look at the school calendar. We have to look at our grading practices, and there's so many things, because, hey, homework is another one. So we also have to innovate with purpose. Technology is not a silver bullet. It's not going to make you a great teacher, a great school, or a great system. What does is how technology can support and enhance learning, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. Number 3, in this disruptive world, we need to challenge our students to think and apply their thinking in relevant and meaningful ways. And that is so important because so many kids, when I go into classrooms, they are bored. They're compliant, they're conforming, they're not engaged. We want to empower not just kids, but families. Number 4, we want to meet the needs of all kids. You know, I talked a little bit about personalization, but let's dive into those high agency elements. Are kids able to use their voice? Are we getting every kid involved? We can use mini whiteboards, non-tech option, or we can use an array of digital tools where every learner can be a part of a lesson. You know, are we allowing kids to choose the right tool for the right task, choose to move forward if they're already competent with that standard, choose to be a virtual learner. Here's one thing we learned globally. Face-to-face learning is not for every student. There are anxiety issues. There are bullying issues. Virtual learning did work for some kids. How do we let kids work at their own pace? If learning is the goal, who cares how long it takes within reason? Can kids choose their own path? And that is really speaking to differentiation. If we put kids on a linear path, we are not creating an equitable culture for them. And are kids able to focus on place? Can they utilize flexible seating? Can they work outside? Can they be virtual? Voice, choice, path, pace, place are high agency elements that can empower kids to learn. How are we using data? We're great at collecting data, but how is data being used in the classroom to group, regroup, provide targeted instruction, to differentiate? Technology is great at curating data, but we have a long way to go globally on how we use that data to meet the needs of kids in the classroom, but also how do we work with families so they can understand the power of data so that they can do more to support their kids at home. Number 5, we got to be better than before. The pandemic taught us that we were not prepared, and that's not a bad thing. We saw resilience, we saw innovation, and as we think about getting better than before, we need to use research and evidence to guide the way. When we change for the sake of change does not work, everybody. There is a lot of research out there, but there's also a lot of evidence. And that's, as I spent time this week in schools, there's also great examples of personalization. And what I do with those examples is share them, add context to them so that other schools across the world can say, hey, how can we take this idea and make it our own? As I end, and we talk about engaging families and getting families to be part of the transformation process. And as I listen to everything that my colleagues said, we need to share what's working. Not talk, but we need to show. If we want to scale transformative change with and without technology, we need to share stories of what's working, because those stories are what provide our families with the guidance, the rationale for why are we doing this. So as we think about the stories, what I empower all you to do, share what's working. And think about this. As we talk about transformation, as we listen to what every single one of us has said, why do you do what you do the way you do it? How might you do it better? And what tells you if you are successful? Those are my thoughts.
Eric Sheninger, thank you so much for sharing your views with us. And now I would like to continue with Micheal Stevenson. So what are the broader implications of AI and machine learning for the future of education, especially what people should learn and how they might be assessed?
Thank you. Well, that has been on the mind of a number of the systems that I work with. The systems that do best in PISA British Columbia in Canada, Estonia, Finland, Hong Kong, Singapore. And the question we've had on our mind is not how do we simply perpetuate the victories of the last 20 or 30 years, which may be becoming less relevant by the day, but as you say, when machines can think like humans, how should humans develop their intelligences and complement and harness machine intelligence? So one answer to that question is provided by Ruth Luckin, who works here in London at UCL, and she wrote a book called Machine Intelligence and Human Intelligence. And she framed it this way. She said, well, there's a kind of intelligence which humans share with machines, and you could call that academic intelligence, but that's understanding about the world, broadly speaking. But there are two other intelligences, and maybe only humans can do those. One is social intelligence, that's to say, understanding others, and maybe other life forms, and species. And the third is meta-intelligence, understanding the self. So that's a very interesting frame, but it led us really, I think, to a broader question. And I think a more exciting and open-ended question, which is this: in a world of AI and machine learning, what does human flourishing look like? Which is a big question, in some ways the biggest of all. And it took us not forward into the 21st century, it took us back initially into the ancient world and to Aristotle. Because Aristotle has a view about human flourishing, and he said something like this, that, the person who is flourishing, their life is infused with reason. It's kind of morally oriented. It has some meaning for them, their lives. It has some significance in the world, and their lives are full of wonder and awe. And that's a pretty inspirational thing to say, and particularly to pitch that into the 21st century of machine learning and robot intelligence. So we've set out really to think about what people might learn that would allow them to flourish in that kind of way, and might draw on those intelligences which are distinctive to humans rather than machines. And we've begun to think about three particular competences. One of the prior speakers talked about the vital importance of competencies and going well beyond the old sterile distinctions between knowledge and skills. So we thought about three. The first is adaptive problem solving. Problem solving in some ways has been the center of gravity in learning for 30 years, certainly in PISA, but not adaptive problem solving in the sense of varying your understanding and your behaviors and taking what you've learned from cracking one problem into a completely different problem space. That's what humans do. It's not what machines do. They kind of focus on the problem that you give them, however sophisticated that problem might be. The second competence we came to was ethical decision-making. That ability to weigh your own interests against the interests of others and a changing situation. Some call it perspectival metacognition, and it's certainly at the heart of modern wisdom thinking. But if there's one thing the world needs a little bit more of, it's probably ethical decision-making. And we don't see machines doing that so well. And the third and final area we've gone into is a little further from the center of learning still, at least the learning we've known for the last 30 years, and that is aesthetic perception. Do you know what's beautiful and fine in the world? Can you put that in the middle of your life? And we're not just talking about, do you recognize a brilliant painting by Michelangelo when you see it? This could be, are you moved by the mountains, or walking home after rain at dusk, or the beauty of a crystal as you look at it through a microscope? But we think that there's something in equipping every learner to build their own personal stock of beautiful and remarkable experiences that might grow through life. So with those three competences in mind, we've looked a bit further. We've thought about the learning models that might take, not just traditional guided instruction, but also action learning, and of course, experiential learning, which may or may not be delivered by EdTech. The first probably yes, the third probably no. And we've looked at new forms of assessment, recognizing that assessment is shifting from summative assessment to formative assessment. And are there new ways which can be rigorous, embedded in the technology and in the learning, and useful to learners and to employers and others, future educators, in other words, credentialing. We thought about the formative assessment framework that might be the way forward for all of this. And finally, we've asked the most important question of all, which is, so, okay, what's the purpose of education in that world of AI and machine learning? And I think that is about how education responds to the world that we built for ourselves, which is a challenging place. You know, you could say, as many do, that our social and economic models have run out of road, that we live in an era of profound political contestation, be that in the UK, the USA, or indeed Turkey, and that in some ways education has connived, has been complicit in over-focusing us on a small number of knowledge-oriented competences, cognitive analytical competences, and in creating a pretty divisive meritocracy. But maybe it's education's turn to get us out all of that. And that might mean equipping everybody with the kind of deep personal capacities that they will need for this future to survive and to thrive. I think of the kind of journey that Otto Scharmer thinks everybody might go on, understanding their world, connecting with their deepest capacities, designing and prototyping for the future. It might mean an education which actually helps us, as somebody said earlier, generate the solutions we desperately need to our deepest problems, economic, social, political. And if all of that's right, then we'd be rethinking Aristotle, because Aristotle, and this was his frame, could really only think about the flourishing individual. And there's now a chance, I think, to think about the flourishing society and all of us in a new relationship with our society and indeed with our planet, so that we move forward in a balanced way. So I guess, you know, those are the thoughts that are prompted by plunging ourselves and our world into a full AI and machine learning environment in which we have to figure out for the first time, at least in this very deep way, what the function of human intelligence and therefore education is, as everything changes.
Thank you, Micheal, Stevenson, and we are in the last 30 minutes of our panel and we have very limited time. Sümeyye, Ceylan, I'm very excited to hear your views, and I would like to ask you that what innovative practices can be done to support students' social and emotional development in traditional education systems?
First, I want to emphasize that social and emotional skills are often overshadowed by cognitive skills in many institutions in the world. And these skills are extremely important to the well-being of the child and the adult, because if we want to raise happy and healthy children, I think cognitive skills comes in the second place. We must put the social and emotional skills in the first place while designing education. These skills are about connecting someone with oneself, listening and understanding others, and controlling emotions, as well as being able to listen, understand, and dialogue with people who doesn't think the same as herself or himself. That's why they actually play a critical role in the formation of modern healthy societies. There are 5 basic competence areas in the social emotional model: self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. All these are about oneself and having a relation in a society. So if we want to implement these skills and these competencies, as Mr. Sheninger emphasized, in the school ecosystem, we shouldn't package this. This is mostly done in education institutions I worked with. They make a package like social emotional education package, and they put it in the education program in a class. Here, this class is social education, emotional education class. I think this must end, because these achievements are vitally important and should be engraved in the school ecosystem and into the curricula and teachers' education, because all these factors, when they are ready, when they are able to furnish themselves in these skills, then they can support children. In this period, when pressure was heavy in these times we are living, to measure the impact of education, it's important that these programs, these competencies, which support social emotional skills, shouldn't create a competitive atmosphere either. And we should find a way to evaluate these skills, competences in a more gentle way, not in a competitive ranking, right, wrong, because it's not in the nature of the social emotional competencies. I want to give a few examples to, I know that there are teachers and school managers listening to us. How can we put these skills in the school environment? For example, I'm a mathematician. In a mathematics lesson, we can turn this lesson in a, we can put social emotional skills in a mathematics lesson too. We show a graph showing the salary between children, man, woman in the same profession, and we can raise questions which allows children to raise empathy and question the social rankings, for example, which is not the main topic of mathematics class, but we can do that. And another example, in history lesson, we can have an example from history, and we can question the dilemmas people experience, consequences of these behaviors. How could this person have made this decision better or other ways? How do you think it was difficult to make this decision? Building empathy. What were the consequences of this decision? What would happen if they behaved in other ways? So on. In addition to integrating skills in the curriculum, we can integrate and raise simple questions in daily interactions in the school environment. For example, when a student engages in behavior which hurts a fellow class roommate, then they can ask, how did this behavior affect others? How will this behavior affect me? What caused this behavior? And why did I do that? What are the feelings behind which bring me to this situation? We as educators can create bubbles in the school environment where we can raise the social, emotional competencies of the children.
Thank you, Sümeyye, Ceylan. And Punya, Mishra, could you please tell us what do you think about the hybrid education system that are spreading faster due to the pandemic? And what are their advantages and disadvantages?
Yes, thank you. I just want to, before I go ahead, I want to just make a couple of quick points about people who spoke before. So, Umar, I really appreciated the point you made about the example that you gave from Pakistan, because I think very often when we look at education, we see it in a very monolithic way. And so whenever I talk of the future, I always try to use the plural because there are many different presents right now. Education plays out very differently even within the United States and when you look globally. And I think that the role of technology is going to be different in each of these contexts. So, so when we think about the role of technology or hybrid or whatever it may be, understanding that the local context is going to matter a great deal, even though we live in a globally interconnected world. So I think that's sort of something very important to keep in mind. And second, I also want to emphasize what you said, Micheal, about sort of the role of the aesthetic, because I think that is something that in education we have not given much weightage to, and in some ways is really what connects the points that were being made by many of the speakers across the sciences and the humanities. I mean, if you talk to mathematicians, if you talk to scientists, they speak very poetically about the work they do. Much less often do they speak of it in instrumental sort of economic terms. And that primary impulse towards learning has not made a bigger part of our educational system, has always, to me personally, seemed like a tragedy. Now coming to, I think, the point of of these different hybrid models, I think that is actually a good thing in the sense that we have for too long, as Eric was saying, stuck to certain modes of education. We have taken certain things for granted. There are assumptions that we have made that we do not dare question. And if one thing that the pandemic has done, it has suddenly taken a whole bunch of the assumptions and just blown them up. I wrote a piece right after the pandemic started called The Value of School. And in sort of tongue-in-cheek, the last item in the list was learning. School is a place for social emotional growth, as one of our speakers has so eloquently spoken. School is a place where you come and make friends. School is the hub of the community. School is a place where you play sports. It's a place where you learn music and engage with the arts for the first time. So school is usually a place where sometimes the only place where kids are getting a warm meal, a good hot meal. And so when we think about these hybrid systems, I think, again, we need to think about what role does the school play in that community. And just because we can do certain things online doesn't reduce the importance of the other aspects of schooling. I mean, so one of the jokes I made during the pandemic is what we took the best thing about school, which is to go and hang out with your friends. And we kept the worst part of school, which is you put you in a chair and said, and there was this big worry that kids are tuning out. And my point was, kids are already tuning out. Why do you think just because you have them sitting in a chair in front of you that they're tuned in? They aren't. Now, at least they had a choice to switch off their video and go off and do whatever the heck they wanted, right? And so I think we have to fundamentally rethink this. Again, it comes back to this question of systems, that a school doesn't exist in an isolation. It is part of an interlocking set of economic, social, community systems. And the context of the schools and the sort of the size and thing that, Umar, that you described in Pakistan is very different from the context here in, let's say, Gilbert versus 20 miles down the road in Phoenix. And to think that there is going to be one future for all of these is a gross mistake. That technology will play out differently. That this technology is going to penetrate each of our lives, I have no doubt about it. I mean, I grew up in India, where to make a phone call when I was an undergraduate, I would have to go to a place and make this trunk call, pay this guy 50 rupees or something. And after 2 hours, I would get a call to my parents. And India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Africa leapfrogged into the cell phone age. Within years, it's a completely different story, right? However, the role of the cell phone in India is different than the role of the cell phone in the US. I don't know how many of you, Turkey might have this too, or might have had this too, this idea of the missed call. So this is where in India, it used to be so expensive to even make a phone call. So you would do this where the parent would tell the kid, like when you reach wherever you have to go, give me a missed call, which means you call, it rings twice, then you shut it off. So the meaning of this device is more than just the device itself. It exists within a social, political, cultural context. The fact that Facebook spends 85% of its fight against disinformation only in the US says something about the social, political consequences and historical consequences of this legacy that we live in, right? I mean, the impact of these technologies, we can keep talking about what happens in a classroom unless we see the broader context within which these technologies play, we will miss the boat. And I think that sort of, if there's one thing I want all of us to sort of think about is, and again, Michael, thank you for bringing up sort of the ethical and moral dimensions of this. Because I think these are very deep ethical, moral questions that we as a culture have to ask. As a people, we have to ask. We are really at a cusp of whether it's global climate change or it's further pandemics or what have you. We, I think, are at a very critical moment with the fourth industrial revolution that was mentioned. But I don't think that we are really asking the right questions. Our discussion really has to be, how does this global and local connect? What are the systems and structures in place? And I don't think we're necessarily doing that. So we will see a lot of, coming back to the main question, we will see a lot of hybrid models, absolutely. But again, what purpose are they serving? If they're still serving to have the same educational system which has brought us to this position, I don't think they're solving the right problems. And I know we are tight on time, so I know there are others who have to speak, so I will pause.
Punya, Mishra, thank you so much. And I would like to talk with Umar, Saif. Mr. Saif, students can acquire very different skills through different digital tools. What are your views on the skills and competencies that students should receive in the era of digitalization?
Thank you for that question, and I know that we have to finish in a few minutes now. But one of the things I wanted to highlight was that we've sort of all spoken about various different kinds of education, and it might be interesting to kind of dissect this a little bit. And you've mentioned skills. I think there's sort of school education, there is higher education, then there's skills. And I think technology would have some role to play in all three. In skills is perhaps the most obvious and the easiest, where kids playing video games or whatever they call them these days on their tablets and phones and so on pick up a lot of skills, and therefore I think skills are probably the easiest to pick up because from sort of digital online learning in one way or the other. I think higher education, we might still be able to unbundle. And Professor Mishra is right that, of course, school is a place of interaction, social interaction, and it's a complex machinery where many moving parts come together in the formative years of someone growing up and learning to learn or learning to interact, in the society or find their place, etc., etc. But I think higher education you might be able to unbundle. And I think there is kind of serious attempt at wanting to do that now. And there are, of course, many large initiatives kind of taking a stab at that, at trying to find how you could unbundle. Can you unbundle a dormitory from a university? So can you do like online distance education? Can you unbundle testing from learning? So that's kind of, can you unbundle research from teaching, and so on and so forth. So I think there's sort of interesting models, and as like a university professor, and I guess most of us in this panel are university professors, that's the aspect we can speak about kind of a little more certainty, because we've seen university is also complex moving complex machinery with many moving parts coming together, and some of those parts I think can be teased apart and unbundled, and therefore maybe the university of the future would be a very different university. It'll use a lot of technology, maybe it'll impart a lot of skills. Maybe the value of a degree would be downgraded to that of a medallion for a taxi driver. That's the tweet that I saw a few days ago. So maybe that will happen. So maybe you will also separate out testing and diplomas or degrees from learning and skills and so on. So the university might get unbundled at some stage. School education, I think, is more profound. So there is a lot more that goes into school education. I think Professor Mishra's comment about learning being almost the last bullet point in his list of things that a school of tomorrow would do is deliberately provocative, but provocative in the right way. Where I do believe that there are lots of other things that you, of course, learn in a school environment, surrounded by peers, in this social environment where learning is certainly part of it, but it's not really just textbook learning. You do a lot more than that in a school. So unbundling that sort of from might take more. It would require sort of deeper thinking and understanding of how in our formative years we learn and what skills do we acquire and so on. Skills are probably the easiest to do. And we've seen that, sort of that people kind of, pick up skills even beyond school. You've done literature in college, but you become a kind of you become a Wall Street trader. You'll pick up some quant tools. You've done medicine, but you end up doing something entirely different, etc. Especially in the US education system, a lot of people do things very different to their undergrad education degree, so to speak. And because these skills are easy to pick up, and digital technology is, of course, enabled everyone to kind of pick up these skills, but also knowledge. I was reading this news yesterday about the NASA's DART spacecraft, which they are shooting at an asteroid or a meteor or something to kind of deviate that a little bit from striking the Earth. So excitedly, I told this to my younger son, who's only 14, and he said he's been following this for 3 years and it's delayed by a year. So, so I certainly wasn't equipped to have this conversation with him anymore. So I backed off and started to learn facts from him about this. And he picked it up from some YouTube channel that he's been following, maybe the NASA's YouTube channel or something, where he's been following this DART spacecraft. So knowledge, access to knowledge, skills, I think technology would play a huge role. You also asked a question about the role of AI. I think it will certainly have, at least in my part of the world, it will have a role in individual sort of customized, very tailored learning, which is what you need in these environments where different students are at a different learning level, even within the same classroom. And two, in automated testing. And that has really come of age. And I remember, again, from my many years ago when I was in US, and edX was just being put together, there was a lot of emphasis on some kind of automated testing where, sort of you could do testing both in terms of kind of multiple choice questions, but written answers, etc. What is it that you could automatically test, both in terms of automatically grade, but also automatically kind of, generate a test. So automated test generation, so to speak, or automated grading is something that would use technology, aspects of AI. Of course, we've seen a lot of that in aptitude tests with SATs, etc. If you answer a question, the next one's a little harder and so on and so forth. And you could also kind of, a lot of these now standardized aptitude tests, etc., come out of automated testing platforms. And they're becoming more and more intelligent, and kind of they're using better and better technology to do it. And I guess the same would eventually get used in more and more kind of grading also. So I think those are sort of two obvious and more practical kind of examples of how I think AI and tech would begin to influence or find its way into education. I don't think we're going to replace a teacher with a robot anytime soon. I hope not. Some of us have been trained for our livelihoods to become professors. So I hope we don't get replaced by a robot. That doesn't happen. But I think that sort of some of these things are practical, very tangible, immediately doable, and a lot of things are happening already. And I'm sure technology and AI and machine learning, etc., has huge role to play in skills building, in higher education, and perhaps in school education. So I'll stop here.
Umar, Saif, thank you so much for sharing your views with us. And I would like to ask to Eric Sheninger that, do you think that the current transformation can create an opportunity for equity in education?
Yeah, I think I agree with what everyone said. We have to question, everything that we do. And as we think about equity, it becomes down to this, don't prepare learners for something. We need to prepare them for anything, because we don't know what that something is, and when I go in, I see a lot of knowledge and recall and facts, because that's what the kids are going to be tested on. But when we think about equity, we have to understand that, with our learners, the ones who might not go to college, which is fine. We look at our trades, we look at auto mechanics, carpenters, farmers, electricians. They can demonstrate a level of thinking that many of us cannot. So we have to make sure that we're creating equitable cultures, not just in our classroom, but also in our systems. The one thing that we did when I was a secondary principal is we created learning academies that any student could be a part of. STEAM, arts and letters, global leadership. We had them engage in cohort models of learning beginning in the middle grades. So I think we have to look not just about what's happening in our classroom, but look beyond and ask ourselves, how does our culture in our systems prepare kids to be competent? And, as we mentioned, all these different types of competencies, and that was a question that was asked previously, we have to look at, okay, when we think about equity, and as I defined it, equity is all kids getting what they need, when and where they need it. But what are those specific aspects that we want our learners to be competent in? And in my work, I look at it as, are we empowering them to be creative scholars where they can generate and explore their own ideas? Reflective learners where they can evaluate their strengths and their limitations. Collaborative workers where they can engage confidently with others. Active engagers who are ready to explore issues, self-directed managers who can take initiative and embrace change, and autonomous inquirers who can process and evaluate information. So equity really resides on understanding the strengths, the areas of growth, because we have to get past deficit-minded thinking. And I don't like here in America where we say special education. Kids learn differently. And I like that terminology better, because I think that really then focuses more on the SEL aspects of what we want to accomplish. But also we have to look at our own practices. And coming back full circle, as we look at the topic of our conversation today, where it really started with digitalization, is, all right, how are students using technology to learn in ways they couldn't without it? And I think that's a fundamental question as we discuss whether fourth industrial revolution, fifth industrial revolution, SEL competencies, but what are kids able to do with it they couldn't do before? And I think also as adults, how does our use of technology represent a fundamental improvement over what we did in the past without it? So equity, as I share my last thought, is we also have to look at equity in terms of how we learn as adults. If we learn under the same archaic constraints, we look at our one and done drive-by. Here in America, we call it professional development. And this is why nothing changes, because we're not creating equitable experiences for adult learners that they can then translate into their classroom or school systems. So the aspect of leadership is we get what we model. So everything that all of my esteemed colleagues talked about today, how is that being facilitated with adult learners so that they are better equipped with the competencies to lead this change in classrooms, in schools, in organizations? I remember, when I was working with a school here, and they said, "Hey, Eric, we know about choice boards. We want you to have us go through a choice board activity." And I had never created a choice board before, but when I did it, I was able to really focus on the aspects of personalization. But the educators, what I'm trying to say is they got to experience a personalized pathway instead of me just dictating to them what they should do. So with equity, we need to model it, we need to value it, and we also have to look beyond our silos and our own lenses, see what others are doing, and adapt those ideas so that we can become the best iteration of ourselves for our learners and for those that we work with.
Thank you so much, Eric Sheninger. We're already exceeded time, but lastly, I would like to back to all our speakers in order to take their last views shortly. And Micheal, Stevenson, what else would you like to add more on this subject?
Well, I don't know. I think I've probably said quite enough, really. I think I do feel that the education conversation has been pretty quiet for a very long time. I think it's been on a single track for 30 years, equipping young people, and all young people to be fair, with foundational literacies. And as it happens, and as PISA shows, we're not getting better at that. We're flatlining. Science, maths, and reading. Suddenly it feels like a time of flux. What should we learn? And for what purpose? And can we again put education as a great engine behind a better world? So it's slightly terrifying, but it's also a very exciting time to be thinking about the future of education. And it feels like all the people on this call today have been part of that conversation, and I'm really grateful to all of you in Istanbul for bringing us together.
Thank you so much. And Sümeyye, Ceylan, what else would you like to add more on the subject?
I want to give you a brief experience I had with a child. We developed a program called Forest Explorers. This program is built upon the idea that the best teacher is nature. So nature, the best technology, the highest technology, the nature produces the highest technology. We teach children biomimicry and we take with them a walk through the nature, the nearest forest, which is near the education institution. And at the end of one of these walks, an 8-year-old, we have SEL competencies in the program too. We close our eyes, we lock one sense up, and then try to sense with the other sense. For example, we close our eyes and then we listen. And when we are done with this activity in our walk, this 8-year-old boy opened his eyes and said, "Wow, the forest has the highest resolution. It has really megapixels." So I think with COVID, children are they are too much into technology. Every psychological research says that even adults shouldn't spend more than 2 hours, doing stuff with technology to maintain their psychological health. but we spent almost 10 or 12, the world spends almost 7 hours a day with digital technologies. So I want technology to be used accordingly, and I don't want technology to be a tsunami and have our lives. So I think we should bring play and technology together and try to build education systems more based on the One Health, the health of the planet, not just the well-being of human beings. Thank you all.
Sümeyye, Ceylan, thank you so much. And Punya, Mishra, we also would like to hear your last views.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on and for this conversation. It's great to hear all the different perspectives. And I know that we are over time, and I've already spoken a lot. I think I've made my perspective pretty clear. So again, thank you very much and have a wonderful evening, morning, day, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you so much. And Umar, Saif, what else would you like to add more on the subject?
Well, not much. Thank you for having me and letting me add my perspective on the use of technology in sort of low-income emerging countries, where I think this isn't just a kind of a nice to have thing in a classroom, but maybe the key for access to education for tens of millions of children in low-income countries. And I think that's where technology could have a profound impact in better learning outcomes, in educating children who can't afford to go to school, and access to education. But it's been a fascinating panel. I learned a lot from everyone in this panel. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And Eric, Sheninger, we also would like to hear your last views on the subject.
Well, everything we do comes down to relationships. Without trust, there's no relationship. Without relationships, no real learning occurs. And my parting thoughts are, I just want to thank every single one of you who are doing the work. Those of you in classrooms, those of you in schools, those of us on the outside are in your debt. You got through the most challenging time. You found a way. You continue to show up. You cared for kids. And you showed the world why education is the most amazing profession. So thank you all for what you have and you continue to do.
Thank you so much, and I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers for this valuable session. In the last session, our speakers highlighted us on the digitalization and internationalization on education, new digital transformation and their impacts on education. After completing the question and answer part, we came to the end of the first day of Istanbul Education Summit. Hope to see you again tomorrow.
The impact of digitalization on education. There's a rapid and influential digitalization process across the world. It's inevitable to experience digital transformation in education. What opportunities do AI, AR, and VR technologies offer in education? What kind of materials should be used in the digital era?